Have the huge privilege to be for a second time on stage with one of my great historian heroes. When I grow up, I want to be like Caroline. I told her story, a version of it yesterday, and she will be telling her own, and I think part of the story herself. But the key extraordinary achievement was that having written this astonishing book on Mau Mau, using the oral interviews largely of the survivors, going out, finding people who'd fought this insurgency, and what they'd suffered at the hands of the British, who tried to put down with great brutality the Mau Mau rebellion. There were some who doubted her work and accused her of believing her interlocutors uncritically, that there was nothing to prove that these testimonies had any basis in fact. And over a long series of legal battles, Caroline eventually forced the British Foreign Office to admit that there was an archive with all the documentation of all this brutal anti-insurgency stuff, sitting literally in a secret bunker in Northumberland, a most extraordinary story. And I think some of those documents are now the basis of this book. Because, as she realized, and as she will be telling us, Mau Mau was not alone. It was part of a pattern that started in Ireland, that proceeded through Palestine. We heard about that yesterday in the Palestinian revolt. Thank you so much. And then Malaya, Cyprus, and then back to Ireland, but this time to Belfast. And we will see over the next half an hour the extraordinary way in which the same characters turn up in all these theatres using the same techniques. And she's managed to draw a thread through this. So it's a very unsavory view of the last days of the British Empire, and as part of the story that we British would prefer to forget, but which it's very important that we don't. So Caroline, with that, please welcome the Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard professor, Caroline Elkins, hero of this festival.
Wow. Thank you, Willie. You're hired as my PR person. That's for could you please put up the presentation? Terrific. There we go. There we go. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. And as William was pointing out, I think what I'd like to do this morning is paint a little bit of a sketch of how I got from Kenya to Palestine and then to Malaya and elsewhere. And I think in many ways it's just the questioning and curiosity of an historian to try to answer what seems to be unanswerable questions in different ways. And I think the most important thing is to be thinking about, with Imperial Reckoning, or it's also called, that's a title in the US, in the UK, in Commonwealth, it was Britain's Gulag. But really at its...
do what I do, which is buy 2 copies, thinking they're different books.
It was, I'm not sure if it was a publishing flaw or whether it was good, but never let the publishers give 2 different titles to your book. It's just confusing. But the book was at its root really an act of historical reconstruction of the detention camp system and villages in colonial Kenya. And they were established by the British as a response to the Mau Mau uprising that took place between 1952 and 1960. And the book really at its heart was bearing witness, establishing something as fact. It demonstrated that systematized violence was enacted, and murder and torture, and these were not just one-offs. And the knowledge of this went all the way up to the highest levels of governance, up to Churchill and others. And what became clear in the context of the book, in writing it, was that sort of not just hundreds of thousands of files were missing in the archives. We knew they were gone. There were rumors of file destruction. And so, but look, I mean, one thing that we know, and William was just referring to this, first of all good all good purges leave something behind. And so I was a graduate student with lots of money and time on our hands, fortunately really the privilege of even at that point being at Harvard. And I spent years sort of combing through the archives, looking for any kind of nuggets of documentation that was remaining. And at the same time, interviewed hundreds of those who had survived these camps and villages, as well as former missionaries and colonial officers. But what happened is that I got done with the work, and I had a lot of unanswered questions. And the big one was sort of how and why did this happen? As I said, this bore witness to establishing this as fact. It was clear to me in the context of my work that people were coming out, sort of British colonial officials and military officers and intelligence officers were coming into Kenya and then leaving Kenya and going somewhere else. And we'll talk about it. So there's sort of one hot spot to the next. And you know, at the same time, there was this notion, even amongst Kenyan historians, first of all, that the findings of this work, it was not terribly well received when it first came out, I should say. The book itself is hugely criticized when it comes out in 2005. But there was certainly this notion that the British were exceptional, and that Kenya was exceptional, that all the settlers there and the rest. And so I thought, in other words, that the settlers who were in Kenya somehow or another were attributed to the fact that there was, you know, sort of this epitomized sort of racism in the empire, which translated into extraordinary violence when the British government enabled or declared a state of emergency. But I really had my doubts about this, and what happened though is that as I sort of was moving along and beginning the research on this, I'm just at the starting point of this new project, which eventually becomes Legacy of Violence, and something quite unusual intervenes, and that is in the form of 5 elderly Kenyans from the highlands of central Kenya, who sued Her Majesty's government in the High Court of London. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office was the named defendant in the case. And when the case is filed, this is not a case of sort of one government against another, but it's actually the first time that international tort law is used by, it was a combination of Lee Day, a big human rights group in London, and the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. And so what this is one big personal injury case. Basically, it is a failure of duty of care by the British government that they're suing them for this. And I was, when the case is being filed in 2009, I was, in Imperial Reckoning forms the documentary basis for the case. I was asked to be expert witness, which I readily agreed to do. And there are many sort of surprises that happen along the way in the case, but it also, as Willie was referring to, what was rather shocking about partway through, after repeated requests for document discovery, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office calls an emergency hearing, which I'll be frank, like never happens. It happens on Law and Order. Like I figured I was very prepared to be expert witness because I watch Law and Order religiously, and it did nothing to prepare me to be expert witness for this case. And emergency hearings don't happen, but in this case it did. And in sum, the Foreign Commonwealth Office's QC says, "Your Honorable Venerable Sir, the most incredible thing has just happened. We have just discovered, thanks to all the document requests, we have just discovered 300 boxes of previously undisclosed files at Hanslope Park," which is the big where they keep all their MI5 and MI6 files. And oh, by the way, right next to these files, were 8,000, or the boxes, were 8,000 other files from 36 other colonies, similarly packed up and spirited away at the time of decolonization. So think about this. The British government really had been sitting on these documents for decades, and we can sort of chat about afterward how long they knew about it and who knew about it, but...
I mean, were they lost or were they definitely hidden?
They were hidden.
They were.
I mean, okay, great question, because of course, as is wont to happen with the British government and empire, when you want to kick the can of accountability down the road, you get a commission. And the commission then does a report. And the report then uses all kinds of euphemisms, in this case, that they were misplaced. They were, that they'd gone missing. I love the passive voice, "they went missing." And so and this was the Kerry report that happens in the subsequent aftermath of this, and it really does. It certainly, they call it sort of administrative bungle, if you will. Be that as it may, if you can suspend your belief that they, after years of not just Kenya but other parts of the empire asking for their documents, that they had administratively bungled this. Be that as it may.
Could you just say how you got them? What was the legal mechanism you used to get them to admit to this? Because presumably they could have just sat on them without this forever.
Yes, and I think this is really important in the context of the lawsuit, and again, getting back to the cascading effects or the unintended consequences, if you will. The British government, when the suit is filed, says they're going to fight this every step of the way, that they are not going to give in. And look, if you think about it in hindsight, certainly I know from the context of the case that they would have settled very early on for sort of a modest amount and perhaps some form of acknowledgement that this had happened. And it was actually the Labour government that was in power when this happens. But they don't, and then the Conservative government comes in, William Hague takes over as in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and as I said, they declare they're going to fight it to the end. But remember, we have, in this case, they have the power of the court behind them demanding the documents. And I was very cynical as a historian because we file FIOs all the time, Freedom of Information Act requests, and the government says, oh no, so sorry, we have nothing. But the Lee Day attorneys kept saying to me, they cannot sidestep a court request for document discovery.
And individuals who do this could be got for contempt of court
Precisely.
if they personally did not fess up.
Precisely. And you know, what happens though is ultimately it is if one believes the story, it is a very junior desk officer by the name of Edward Inglet, who and he's a desk officer for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the East African desk, who after sort of the third time or so of these repeated document requests coming in, says, wait a minute. He rings up Hanslope Park and says, I'm going to come out and have a look. This is in the early part of a Monday, Tuesday of the week. And he's going to go on Friday. And somehow or another, by Thursday afternoon, he gets a phone call back and says, no, wait, it's okay. You can't imagine. We just found all those documents that you've been asking for. And so whatever happens behind the scenes, we don't know, but we do know those documents are discovered. And I, as expert witness, I had a team of students. We had a war room back at Harvard. And what happens is they would scan and upload the documents. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office could decide what document, remember, the defendant was deciding what documents they thought were relevant to us. And so began this back and forth of, because we had the hand list.
Can we just go back to that scanning operation again? I love the idea of this ward. I mean, how many students, how many documents scanned?
Yeah, there were 6 students, and we basically were working 24/7. My job over a period of 9 months as expert witness for the court was to provide the court with a report on what was in this documentation. So we were literally, for those familiar, particularly with human rights litigation, we were down to how many murders happened, how many tortures happened, how many sexual assaults happened, and chronicling them, chronicling how systematized this was. It's very important to remember that we had to prove to the court that this was not a series of one-offs, that this was systematized, and that the British government not only knew this was happening and failed to stop it, but even better if we could show to the court that they were inveigling with the colonial government in Kenya, that the colonial office back in London was working with the colonial office, with the Kenyan colonial government in Kenya to introduce these policies. And so one of the responsibilities was to take some of the work in Imperial Reckoning. I had some documentation in here, and there was some that remained very important for the court, but to then supplement it with others, because one of the high bars, the British government tries to strike the case out twice, sort of motion for summary judgment. And the second strikeout hearing was about statute of limitations. And in a tort claim, statute of limitations is 3 years. This was 50 years after the events. Nobody in the legal community thought we were going to get past that. And by the way, I should point out, when I stepped up and said I would be expert witness, which I really didn't think twice about, nobody at Lee Day told me that in the legal community, the case's tagline was the no-hoper. Nobody thought this case. No one thought it had a prayer. But that the law firm was taking this on for the purposes of really historical record, right? And they thought that this was, and I really hats off to Martin Day in particular, who was taking on several million quid of legal costs with no expectation that he was going to recover any of that. And so with that, I mean, this case is really a series of people taking enormous risks. Not really myself per se, but these claimants in particular in the law firm. Anyway, these files come out, and what we find out, along with a whole range of other things, is we get the documents for the first time ever. We get the documents documenting the document destruction. So, we find out under something called Operation Legacy that the systematization of the document destruction was very similar to the systematization of the violence perpetrated against the minds and bodies of these detainees in the 1950s. And by the way, the same person who eventually in 1957 becomes in charge of the torture in the camps, his name is Terence Gavihan. By 1959, he becomes the chief archivist. He becomes the person in charge of deciding which documents get destroyed, burned, which documents go back to London, those that end up being included in the Hanslope disclosure, and those, frankly, benign documents that get left behind. And this is a 3-4 year process between the late 1950s and 1963, when they finally decolonized, of document sifting, sorting, destruction, keeping, and they're moving them back and forth. Lock boxes are discovered, which RAF planes are carrying which documents. And ultimately, we discover, in the context, too, of this case, that destroyed in Kenya were 3.5 tons of documents. Think about that, 3.5 tons of documents. And you might be asking yourself, why are they telling us this? Why are they giving it? So they're not giving us anything, and because there's a whole lot of back and forth. They're not giving us, by the way, all the document dump at once. They would scan and upload them, and then we'd download them, and it would be, it's like getting a novel, page 97, then page 3, then page 140. So they were just making our jobs difficult, very difficult. But we're getting the documents documenting document destruction because the second part of the strikeout hearing was that statute of limitations. And to overcome statute of limitations, we had to show that 50 years after the events, the British government could still have a fair trial. It was absolutely crucial to show that. So one of our jobs, or one of my jobs in this expert witness report, was to provide file after file after file of all of the existing documents that were germane to this, to the court. And included in that was some of this documentation on the document destruction. And they get in there, and like my heart sank because the QC gets up and says, "Oh, thank you, Professor Elkins. You have been so thorough. You honored," like they took Willie's script, "you honorable Harvard professor, so detail-oriented. You've demonstrated to the court that 3.5 tons of documents were destroyed." Well, how could Her Majesty's government possibly have a fair trial with 3.5 tons of documents destroyed? Even though we gave the orders under Operation Legacy to destroy documentation, those renegade colonial officers back in Kenya, they took those orders too far. And by the way, they try to bifurcate the state, what they call the divisibility of the crown. What they say, their argument to the court, is that the crown is divisible. And in layman's term, what they mean by that is that there's the crown that's acting in right of Britain and the crown acting in right of Kenya. And if you divide the crown acting in right of Kenya, it was those officers who just went off the rails and destroyed too much. And at the time of decolonization, which is true, by the way, the Kenyan government inherited all legal liability for those colonial officers acting in right of Kenya. So they're trying to pin it on that. So our job as expert witness was to show that the British government in London, acting in right of the crown in London, was giving the orders side by side, was providing legal coverage, and so of course ultimately the judge rules in the claimant's favor, He waived statute of limitations, which nobody thought would happen. And eventually the case moves towards settlement, and it settles in the spring of June of 2013. The British government, it actually turns out to be a class action settlement. There's over 2,000 claimants involved, and the British government, 5,000 claimants involved, and the British government gives 20 million pounds sterling, a statue to the victims of torture in Nairobi. And importantly, I think for our discussion today, they, for the very first time, admit to the use of torture in the British Empire. And I think that is really a significant moment when we think about historically, and going back even to our discussion yesterday, William, on Palestine, that they own that accountability. And to be frank, there's just no way around it. The evidence is so overwhelming. But back to, in some ways, this other project. So I'm working on all this while I'm working on legacy of violence. And what becomes very clear to me is that the documents, and now it's not just rumor and what we seem to know, I have concrete evidence about the amount of documentation that's destroyed. And so the question becomes, like, what do I do with a book that my time frame, it was really going to be a book about counterinsurgency after World War II. And we know that after World War II, we have a series of end of empire wars, nearly 30 in all. And they move from first Palestine, which we talked about yesterday, with the Zionist insurgency, then to Malaya, then to Kenya, then to Cyprus, then to Aden in Northern Ireland, and there's many others. But if much of the documentation is destroyed, what do you do about that? So one of the things I did is I moved my time frame back, right? I moved my time frame back, and what was going to be an introductory chapter of pre-World War II actually is really now almost two-thirds, at least half of the book. And the other thing that you do is it becomes already was, but sort of, and I'll give you a sense of a global research project. And this gives you a sense of some of the places that I traveled for the work, 14 different research sites, private archives, missionary archives, the Haganah archive in Tel Aviv, for example, where the Haganah stole so many British documents. Their intelligence was so good. I mean, you would have secretaries working for the Haganah who were in the colonial office, who were in the High Commissioner's office, and they dutifully type out the letter for the High Commissioner and then dutifully make a copy of it and give it to the Haganah. And so all of that, even though it was destroyed at the end of Empire in Palestine, and one of the best colonial office files is actually sitting in the Haganah archive in Tel Aviv. And so, I mean, so you get a sense of how all this is unfolding. And just briefly, and the title sort of gives it away of what my sort of findings were, but just briefly, the legacy of violence. And so what is it that I'm really thinking about? Well, first of all, I focus on sort of the ways in which liberalism and the law and violence and historical claim making, the ways in which they congeal, and the ways in which, and I emphasize this, state-directed violence in the British Empire was endemic. And the ways in which not only did it shape lived experience within the empire, but it really the lasting legacy within the contemporary world today. And I think a few things that we need to think about with this, and that is I was very interested in both the relationship between what we call as academic sort of structure and ideology, right? And by structure, what I mean by that is that this notion that with these states of emergency, it's not just that they're sort of popping up from one place to the next, but there's a structure, there's a legal structure to this, right? And ultimately what happens is these become what we think about as states of exception. When ordinary law is not sufficient, right, to contend with violence and uprising in the empire, they introduce sort of exceptional law, states of exception, a state of emergency, right? And we see this evolving early on, which is getting back to why pushing the narrative or the research back in time. And we think about Ireland in the 19th century with the Insurrection Acts and the Coercion Acts. It goes back to, and by the way, these sort of go back and forth around empire. They go back home to the Defense of the Realm Act. Here in India, right, we think about the Defense of India Act, we think about the Rowlatt Acts. India's called...
Just to clarify let's, for example, take the Defense of India Act. What is being, powers to lock people up without trial?
Absolutely. So this gives the state extraordinary power. And ultimately so in other words, by that it means you suspend ordinary law. And in the suspension of ordinary law, you delegate to the executive extraordinary power. So it's in the hands here of the viceroy, or in other colonies, the governor or the high commissioner, whatever the case may be. And they have eventually we get 149 pages of single-spaced emergency regulations. And they all lay dormant until such time as a state of emergency is declared. Right? Or in the case of the Defense of India Act or some of these, where they're on the books and the kinds of power given to the executive. So detention without trial, suspension of due process, censorship of the press, the ability to deport people, exile individuals, the use of communal punishment. So you can go on and on of the kinds of, think about all of these things that are sort of counterintuitive, anathema to liberalism, right? Are then put into place. And the question becomes, how do they rationalize this? How do they think about it? Because they think about the Second Empire as being sort of the epitome of liberal imperialism. That somehow or another Britain was exceptional, that it was bequeathing...
The Belgians do this stuff, the Germans do this stuff, but the Brits do not.
Oh, yeah. And you forgot the wretched French. I mean, the French are the bête noire. I mean, they're the ones who really get empire wrong. And somehow or another, you know, this is a moment in the 19th century when all this is being born, that liberalism, this notion that is really percolating in Britain at the time, reform and, you know, more participation within the democratic process, when it washes up onto the shores of the Second Empire, and it is to be bequeathed to brown and black subjects, in particular non-white subjects, suddenly it gets imbricated in this idea of developmentalism. This idea that one day you too will be like us, but not yet. In the meantime, you are and I use this in quotes, childlike creatures, and I'm quoting from John Stuart Mill and others, and that people like John Stuart Mill, the sort of the father of liberalism in some ways when we think about it, says that in empire that they can rule despotically until such time as empire's children grow up. And of course, not yet is supposed to take generations, if not longer, and ultimately, of course, Willie, it never comes. And this is what we know of as the civilizing mission, or the white man's burden. And so when we think ideologically, there's this notion of the white man's burden that is evolving with states of exception. And so with states of exception, too, when something that I call, it's important to bear in mind that the legal codes and the ideology sort of do this together. And it's sort of this unholy alliance, right?
Keep the mic close.
Okay, unholy alliance between the two. And you know, they're very clever with this. When the legal codes become sufficient to justify the actions of the security forces that come in to put down these states of emergency, well, what do they do about this? Because there's an incredible amount of power being delegated locally to men on the spot. Well, if you need more sort of legal coverage for something that even though you have this broad legal power, and if you look at these things that I've listed off here, this broad legal power, if it's not sufficient, well, you just create new laws, right? And so this act of law creation to provide coverage for increasing uses of violence is something I call legalized lawlessness. Because at some point, they're just taking lawless behavior and rendering it legal by making new laws. And so remember, getting back to sort of connecting the dots to our conversation, when the British government's defending itself in the dock and the High Court for the Mau Mau emergency, they are insisting that everything they're doing is legal under the laws of the time. And of course they're right, but at some point when you're ruling despotically, right, and you're providing 149 pages of tightly scripted emergency regulations that are depriving people of their basic civil liberties, well, you know, the rule of law is kind of turned on its head, right? And so when we think about this, sort of going back to some of my premises, we've got the questions of states of exception and legalized lawlessness. And then we also have what I was saying, getting back to the point of this white man's burden. Well, what happens when we take this white man's burden or the civilizing mission and put it into the context of, if you will, recalcitrant natives, as they were often called, and then they're labeled with all kinds of terms, that, of course, terrorists being one, and bandits and the rest. These were not freedom fighters. They criminalized the behavior. And then they begin to think in terms of the language of the security forces and military personnel of the time, as well as colonial officials. Well, what they start saying is that they start talking about the moral effect of violence. Not only is violence needed from a structural standpoint to protect the colonial state, right, in a Weberian sense of legitimate violence that the state has, but no, there's more to it. That violence has a moral effect, kind of like the biblical, spare the rod, spoil the child. Right? And somehow or another that this violence, and this is, I quote here from Caldwell, it's a very famous book called Small Wars. It's basically the Bible for counterinsurgency, and it comes out in the 19th century, and then he updates it after the South African War. But what's important is that this term, which of course as historians and critical scholars and just in general, we look sort of linguistically, the moral effect of punishment, the moral effect of violence, you will find it littered throughout the historical record, everywhere. From Churchill to Chaim Weizmann to Wingate to, all the way through. And they talk about this over and over again. So it's not just, so where I'm going with this is the insidious nature of this is both structural and ideological. And so then the question becomes, how does this begin to play out? How do we begin to understand the connections? Because going back also, there's this sense amongst scholars before this came out, which was really sort of pervasive, that there was no British way of counterinsurgency.
You should read this, Karen, or maybe,
yes.
maybe. Fanatics and savages must be thoroughly brought to book and cowed, or they will rise again. They must be made to feel the moral effect of punishment.
It's extraordinary, right? It's extraordinary. And by the way, it's happening everywhere. So when we think about aerial bombardment, right, what they called air control, and it's being used here in the Northwest frontier all the time.
Palestine.
Iraq, Palestine, and we're going to get to in a second. I'll just sort of show you before we kind of open it up to how it moves around. But the point is that
often using poison gas.
Poison gas. Iraq becomes. It's the playground of the 1920s. We talked yesterday about mandates when they're trying to control these vast deserts, and it's a bit of imperialism on the cheap, right? And at this point, it's Churchill who's the minister in charge of this, and they're testing everything. By using the newly sort of forming Royal Air Force. And they're dropping all sorts of bombs, right? And they're testing with chemical weapons and all sorts of things. And so these things are evolving as they're moving through empire. And so ultimately, I think it's useful to getting back to sort of, my own, if you will, sort of discovery with this project was that so often, for reasons that we can chat about, but so often we think about sort of this dividing line with World War II. And if you divide our understanding of historical processes with World War II, particularly around questions of imperial violence and colonial violence, you're going to miss the significance, particularly of this earlier period, but very much the interwar period, and even more specifically in the interwar period, Palestine. And it's in 1930s Palestine where all of these ideas and practices and personnel converge. On the legal front, the state of emergency regulations that have been evolving in Ireland and India and going back to, and when I say going back to Britain and the Defense of the Realm Acts, during wartime World War I and also in World War II, something called the Defense of the Realm Act is borrowing from empire the suspension of civil liberties in wartime Britain in order to fight the war. And then they get re-exported back out to empire. But by the time of 1930s Palestine, these emergency regulations were so tightly scripted that at that point the chief secretary, who eventually goes, Henry Gurney, who eventually goes on to Malaya right after Palestine, says basically you could throw the entire thing away and say that the High Commissioner can do whatever he wanted to suppress these things. So let's take a look, though, because structures and ideologies and practices matter, but they're moved by people. And a lot of the story, as we've discussed, is about people. So let's get a sense of sort of just, and we can end on this and open up to questions, of the movement around the empire. And so if we look up here, we've got up top here a guy named Charles Taggart, and he was the head of the police force in Bengal. He's notorious. And I'll just give you a sense, for the interest of time, and I can tell you what he does from place to place. But he's moving. He starts in Ireland. And his work takes him to Bengal.
I love this bit. Look carefully at this animation. This is
and
brilliant.
then he goes
lesson for all future
back
historians
to
how to do this stuff.
And then he goes off to the UK. And then he goes back to Bengal. Back up again. And then he's brought into Palestine in 1936. And he's brought into Palestine, if anybody knows, I mean, he's introducing all of these very harsh practices that are...
And the Taggart forts.
And the Taggart forts. And he builds, anybody wants to know, he builds a wall. He builds a wall across northern Palestine. And of course, he built it with barbed wire, and every night the insurgents would come and pull them down and make mattresses out of them, or mattress springs out of it. But he builds a wall. He builds these Taggarts, which are small, basically black spots, interrogation centers. I mean, they tried to bump him off several times in Bengal. And in fact, he leaves Bengal Churchill tries to save his life by sending him, of course, to Palestine. And his right-hand person is a guy named David Petrie, who's the head of intelligence also in India. And he also is devising all kinds of torture techniques there.
Just talk about this, because let's not brush over this. What are the talks?
Oh, all sorts of things. I mean, the development of what we would think of waterboarding now, which is sort of the teapot method. They would sort of they would hold people down and pour water down their nose, or hang them upside down and urinate into their nostrils.
The idea being it doesn't give bruises and so on.
No,
but
exactly.
does, yeah.
But they were, at this point in time, honestly, Willie, they couldn't care less about the bruises and the like. I mean, it was after World War II, where we have the European Convention on Human Rights, that they're concerned. They are everywhere from horrific sexual violations, castrations, beating, burning. I mean, honestly, it's still, to this day, it's very hard to escape sort of, I can't even imagine what it was like for somebody writing about it. It can enter your mind at different times just how disturbing it was. And so this is David Petrie. He comes back and forth. He ends up here in Palestine from India. Remember, Petrie goes on to be the head of MI5 in the UK. Then we have Henry Tudor, who is the head, he eventually is the head of the Churchill's auxiliaries in Ireland. He oversees what are called the black and tan methods. Anybody who knows black and tan becomes code word for horrific violence and systematized torture used in Ireland. He's then sent off to India, and he then goes down eventually to South Africa. He's back up to India. He's, again, picking up practices. He goes to Egypt for the Egyptian uprising there, again, honing some of his handiwork, back up to Ireland for the War of Independence, and then he ends up also in Palestine. Down here, up, and then, oh yes, and then of course they find him, the IRA finds him in Palestine. He's on the #1, this is actually sort of a bit of a, I mean, it's ironic. When he gets onto the train in Victoria Station to go to Palestine, he's the #2 on the IRA's hit list for what he did in Palestine. For what he did in Ireland. Only behind Wilson, who's even more despised by the IRA, little to the knowledge of Tudor. While his train is pulling out, Wilson is gunned down on the doorstep of his Belgravia home in London, and Tudor now becomes the #1 marked man by the IRA as he gets shipped off to Palestine. They eventually find him there. So Churchill and he, and there's some sort of very personal letters between Tudor and Churchill. They're best buddies from World War I, and Churchill slips him out in the middle of the night, and he pensions off in Newfoundland, which, by the way, tends to be the place where a lot of these former colonial officials, and they're getting bumped off all over the empire, and there's a sort of a collection of them, a club of them up on the coast of Newfoundland, where they all pension before they go on. But and then finally we've got Arthur Harris. I mentioned a moment ago. Harris is one of the young hotshots in the RAF. And he is one of the ones, he's
known to us in Britain as Bomber Harris.
Bomber Harris, because he eventually becomes instrumental in World War II in the bombing of Dresden and the like. He cuts his teeth in empire. He goes down. He's in southern Rhodesia. He forever wears his little southern Rhodesia flash flag on his armies. He's a blazing racist. He loves the empire. He cuts his teeth. He heads off to what becomes Southwest Africa. He then goes back up to the UK for training. He's sent out to India, where he's practicing some of his tactics on the northwest frontier.
He uses gas there?
He's absolutely, they are experimenting with air control. So the planes become these extraordinary delivery. I mean, it's a sort of a light goes off for Churchill, that they've basically, they have a sort of acquired this vast empire that they cannot afford. They don't know how to control large swaths of population, particularly on the frontier. And suddenly you can have a single airplane dropping and everything. Firebombs, shrapnel bombs, they're testing all over the northwest frontier, and of course in Iraq and elsewhere. And it's Bomber Harris, who is the young hotshot, who is known for the person
and in
doing
Palestine,
this.
you have him on Friday nights getting blind drunk and then going hunting Palestinians.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
For
they
fun.
go
Friday night
for fun. And so he's back and forth, and there he is up again, and he goes back down to Palestine. And finally, we all know Bernard Montgomery, very famous, of course, general. He too, he himself, many of these folks are for themselves from Ireland. He goes back to the UK, and this is a dress parade for him for the real thing of World War II. And here he is in Palestine. He goes off to India, and then he's back to Palestine again. So if we look at this map, getting back to, I mean, one of the kind of exercises of this book was a big mapping exercise of really, and there was no single document that, and my poor spouse had to sort of see all these books showing up to my house, these memoirs from God knows where, and these horrendous biographies that you read through just to try to understand who went where and what they were bringing with them, and how do we understand this. But again, I think if we understand empire and we understand historical reconstruction, empire is ultimately about people and what people do and what they think they're doing and how ideas and ideologies move from one place to the next. And, in some ways, just to sort of wind us up, the important thing too, let's see if we can get this to go. All right, hang on. And here we see they all go back to the UK with World War II. But importantly, and here we go, just what happens, it's very important to point out, too, that a lot of my work is drawing upon the significant work that previous scholars had done, but dots hadn't been connected. And when I keep saying that these come back to Europe, which was a big fear of so many early 19th century thinkers, that sort of the despotism of empire would come back to the metropole with these Defense of the Realm Acts. And there's a brilliant, and he died much too young, legal historian named Brian Simpson. And he says, in a perverted sense, the Dora Code and its successors respected the ideal of the rule of law. The practical effect of such a code is to introduce what has been called a form of statutory martial law. So remember, state of emergency is even better than martial law, because when an emergency ends, right, you cannot challenge what was done under statutory martial law, right? Those who enacted acts of violence cannot be brought to task in court. With martial law, when the courts are suspended, once ordinary law comes back in effect, the security forces could in fact be tried. So in many ways, you want this state of exception, this statutory martial law, because it gives you absolutely free hand, and it protects the troops and the police officers and the rest from what they're doing.
And just to clarify that this is not ancient history with black and white photographs, these same laws are in use today in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And the laws with which Palestinians have been locked up without trial for what they call administrative detention are the laws, same
Absolutely.
laws, the British
Absolutely.
laws passed at this time.
Absolutely. I think it's an important point to end on, Willie, which is, if we look here, just to remind you, after Palestine, it goes to the UK during the war, then to Malaya, then to Kenya, then to Cyprus, then to Aden, then to Northern Ireland. These are just a few of the theaters. And then from Malaya, it goes to the United States. If you think this sounds familiar to Strategic Hamlet in Vietnam, it does, because there's a whole group, including Sir Robert Thompson, known as Bream. There's a British delegation that goes and advises the American government how to use state of exception as well as practices and policies that have been enacted in the British Empire. So they remain, all of these are bequeathed, these state of exception laws. So Indira Gandhi uses them, she's drawing upon them here in India when she uses them. Emergency laws. And it's precisely what's being used in Palestine today. And remember, I mean,
you see those guys in underpants being put into trucks.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, one of the things that's really animating some of my thought today when I get done with this is really the question of how does authoritarianism, how is it born from liberalism? Remember, this is liberal imperialism. And the state of exception, this idea of what do you do when ordinary law does not suffice, absolutely vexed early thinkers about liberalism, all the way back to John Locke. When John Locke writes about this, he writes that this is the sort of the Achilles heel of liberalism, and that eventually you're going to have to delegate a certain amount of power to the executive when ordinary laws don't suffice, but that this was to be temporary. Right? And so when you think about it, it's not, yes, it's horrendously happening in Palestine, but also the thing to bear in mind is that this is exactly the tradition from which, when we think of state of exception in the United States today, we come from the same liberal tradition about law and state of exception regulations. And so one of the things that I've written, I wrote a piece recently for the New York Review, sort of tracing a lot of this, but one of the things that we should bear in mind with what's happening in the United States today is that we also have national emergency regulations. We have almost 170 powers that lie dormant until such time as the president declares a state of emergency, and he can use every single one of them, right? Suspension of due process. That's going to be a real contestation. But the more important ones, which can't be really contested, by the way, it's Congress who's already delegated this to him. Suspension of bank accounts, right? Suspension of movements, detention, all the things that are being done today. He has not even begun to touch his legal powers, just like the legal powers of somebody like Henry Gurney in Malaya. So if we look, just looking at this, sort of authoritarianism being born from liberalism, as I mentioned before, Sir Henry Gurney, who had been in Palestine as the chief secretary, goes on to Malaya. He says in 1939, at the end of the revolt, the decimation of the Palestinian population, he says the whole book of emergency regulations could have been expressed in a simple provision empowering the High Commissioner to take any action he wished. Similarly today, Trump says he who saves his country does not violate any law. A similar kind of ethos, a similar kind of emergency powers, by the way, born from liberalism, absolutely legal until such time, getting back to where we began, people like the 5 elderly claimants challenge it in a high court. And so today, so much of the work that you're doing, Willie, and so much of the work that so many other scholars are doing to document what's going on, and the significance of that, we may feel at times that we're 2 steps back, or forward 1 step back, or 3 steps back, but the importance of the continued documentation for this will, I don't want to say sort of fighting fire with pens and textbooks, but it's not unimportant. And I think back to some of the research that became, or documentation that became crucial, absolutely crucial to the detainees in Kenya in their lawsuit, or even here, as you're going to find in your work on, you're already finding on your work on Palestine with the tremendous book that you're going to be writing, missionary archives, private archives, the observations of individuals, what brave people are doing right now in Palestine is instrumental. And so I'll end there, but it's really, it's a story that continues, as we say.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for this extraordinary historian. Absolute story. This is a masterclass in why we study history, why we have literary festivals, why we have to remember. Please, a standing ovation for this amazing woman, please, everyone, up. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this huge
Thank
round
you.
of applause
Thank you.
and this standing ovation,